Hi, my name is Daniel Krueger. This is a presentation from Module 9, the case study. So first I'm going to summarize the case. The people we have involved in this case are Richard, the first-year assistant principal at Rocket Junior High School, James, a student at that school with a reputation for trouble, David, another student, but this time an honor student, a resource officer, the director of secondary ed, and then the mothers of both James and David. Right? And all the events take place at Rocket Junior High. So the first thing that happens is that Richard, the assistant principal, calls James to the office to follow up on James being tardy for a third time. And when entering the hallway, James's teacher witnesses James gives something to David. The teacher thought it could be drugs. So Richard asked the resource officer to escort David to the office as well as James. In the office, James admits that he gave something for David to hold. The resource officer searches David and discovers a weapon, a pair of brass knuckles. As David is being handcuffed, James confesses to threatening David to hold his brass knuckles. The resource officer takes both James and David to the detention center, citing the school board's zero tolerance policy on weapons. Richard calls the parents of both James and David. On the phone, James' mom is not too upset, but David's mother is very upset and arrives in Richard's office. Richard provides her with the address of the detention center that he was sent. Richard filed the paperwork on James, but then tore up the paperwork on David. A week later, David returns to class, and James is enrolled in the disciplinary alternative education program. The director of secondary education urges Richard to follow through with David's expulsion papers. Richard tells the director that he will not comply. The director informs Richard that he'll have to write an official reprimand if he does not follow the policy and submit the expulsion papers for David. So, Section 2, report any legal or ethical issues. Who has been harmed? Well, if Richard files David's paperwork, James and David, the two students, are both harmed because they get expelled from school and enrolled in the disciplinary alternative education program because of the legal issue of possessing a weapon in school. If Richard does not follow the paperwork, then James is still expelled from school and enrolled in the alternative education program, and David is unharmed. But Richard is harmed in this scenario because he'll get an official reprimand for not following school policy. So if I were to synthesize exactly what has happened in a single sentence, I would say that Richard must decide if he'll follow school policy, which would result in David being unfairly punished, or if he will break the school policy, preventing David from being punished, but resulting in his own punishment. So let's synthesize the facts. The people we have involved. We have Richard Inman, the first-year assistant principal from the south side of town, who spent some time and effort to cultivate a relationship with James. We have James, the 15-year-old student at Rocket Junior High, who is muscular, heavily tattooed, and had a very troubled past, but has improved in behavior recently since building this relationship with Richard. And then we have David, an honor student at Rocket Junior High, who's described as being smaller and more slightly built than James. David's almost never in trouble, and as a result, not very well known to Richard. As far as the places involved, we have the junior high school itself. So Rocket Junior High has about 900 students, and it seems to be a little bit divided because the students from the south side of town seem to be more disadvantaged. We have the hallway in the junior high where the exchange of the brass knuckles has occurred. We have Richard's office, where David was searched and the weapons were discovered. And we have the youth detention facility, where David and James were taken by the resource officer. As far as the programs involved, we have the honors classes that David participated in, as well as the school band, where David was a standout member of. We have the board's zero tolerance policy that required both boys to spend no less than 45 days in the in the disciplinary alternative education program. And then we have the disciplinary alternative education program itself, which Richard described as a hellhole, and only James was sent there, not David. So let's review and prioritize the information. All right? If we're looking at damage to the stakeholders, we have David's future and reputation of being a good student at stake. For James, he may lose faith in the public school system if he views it as being unfair, since James and David were both involved in this situation, but only James was punished. And then we have Richard's career at stake, as well as his future plans. Consulting the stakeholders. Richard did consult the families of both James and David on the initial day of the incident. Richard's superiors, it seems like the secondary director of education was aware of the situation, since he urged Richard to fill out the paperwork on David. I'm not sure if the principal is aware of the situation. The school board should also be consulted, since this situation involves their policy on zero tolerance of weapons in school. So can we learn more? All right. So some things that I would like to know is, can the board's policy, their zero tolerance policy, be changed? And what would David's mother do if David were to be punished? So would she be angry enough to sue the school? Is there enough information to make a decision? So even though we don't know all the information that we would like, I do believe that a decision can be made with the information we have available. So, option one. Richard could refuse the secondary director's request to submit David's paperwork. All right? The consequences of this is that David does not get disciplined. All right? James and the community could view the school as being unfair, since James was disciplined but David was not. And Richard would get reprimanded, which would put his career in jeopardy. Option two, we could give in to the secondary director's request to submit David's paperwork. The consequences of this is that David would get expelled for 45 days into the alternative education program, which David, Richard, and David's mother feel like is unjust and unfair. David's mother would then get very upset. She could try to sue. But Richard does not get reprimanded, and his career is not put in jeopardy. And then we have this intermediate option. All right? So Richard could tell the secondary director that he'll fill out the paperwork if he's able to meet with the school board about their policy of zero tolerance. He could also request a meeting with the principal and the director of secondary education to explain his ethical dilemma and his reasoning for not submitting David's paperwork immediately. He should also contact David's mother, explain that he would have no choice in filling out the paperwork, and suggest that she also contact the school board. So what are the pros and cons of each of these three options? Option one, if Richard does not submit the paperwork, right, David doesn't have to suffer the unfair and unjust punishment, and Richard does not have to feel guilty. Those are the pros. The cons is that Richard would get reprimanded by the director of secondary education, and then James would feel that the system has treated him unfairly, since he was the only student who was punished in this incident. Option two, Richard could submit the paperwork, right, which means that he does not get reprimanded, right, and he's following school policy, which means that he's being a good ethical role model. However, David does have to suffer the consequences of an unfair and unjust punishment, which would make David's parents very upset, and then Richard would feel guilty that David got punished. And then if we look at the pros and cons of the intermediate option, right, the pros is that Richard does not get reprimanded because he is filling out the paperwork. He does not feel guilty because he is advocating for both Richard and James. And it could end up with an improved policy instead of their zero tolerance policy on weapons in school. The cons is that if the board doesn't listen to Richard, David may still get punished. So the best choice, I believe, is the intermediate option. Right? In this option, Richard is ultimately filing the paperwork, but he is requesting that he speak to the board about their policy. He's also explaining his ethical dilemma with David's mother and the school principal and the secondary director of education. So finally, we need to implement this choice. All right? This involves contacting the secondary education director, the principal, and David's parents to inform them of the decision. After all the stakeholders have been informed, Richard needs to submit David's expulsion paperwork as required by board policy. He should then request an audience with the school board to discuss their zero tolerance policy and the inadequacies of the disciplinary alternative education program. You see, by recommending exceptions to the zero tolerance policy, Richard will be advocating for David and protecting him from the unjust consequences. By recommending improvements to the district alternative education program, Richard is also advocating for James. Right? Richard earlier described this program as being a hellhole and did feel a little bit guilty in sending James there without much of a fight. So I think recommending these improvements is necessary. Finally, if the board refuses to implement the recommendations that Richard has put forward involving the zero tolerance policy and the district's alternative education program, Richard could reach out to the community or to his teachers' union for support in seeking out these changes. All right, guys, thank you for listening to my take on this very interesting case.